What would you do if the person you loved most in the world forced you to choose between your marriage and your calling to help others? Lisa Rodriguez never imagined that her Saturday morning volunteer work would become the breaking point of her 12-year marriage. When her husband David delivered a devastating ultimatum, she faced an impossible decision that would either destroy her family or abandon the vulnerable community that depended on her healing hands. But what happened next proved that sometimes when you lose everything for doing what's right, the universe has a way of giving you something even more extraordinary in return. This is the story of a woman who chose compassion over comfort, and how an entire town chose to love her back in the most unexpected way imaginable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lisa Rodriguez, and if someone had told me 6 months ago that I would lose my marriage for refusing to abandon sick children, I would have laughed at the impossibility of such a scenario. Back then, my life in Millbrook, Ohio felt as predictable and comfortable as the well-worn path I took every morning from our 2-story colonial house on Elm Street to Cedar Valley Hospital, where I had worked as a registered nurse for 12 years. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew your name at the grocery store, where the high school football games brought the entire town together on Friday nights, and where the changing seasons painted our tree-lined streets in postcard-perfect colors. Our house sat in what locals called the good part of town, where the lawns were manicured, the driveways hosted 2-car garages, and most families could afford both health insurance and annual vacations. David, my husband, had built a successful insurance agency from the ground up, and his client base included half the business owners in our community of 8,000 residents. I remember those Saturday mornings when everything still felt secure and normal. I would wake up in our king-sized bed, slip quietly into my scrubs while David slept in, and drive my blue Honda Civic down the familiar streets toward the south side of town. The transition was always stark and immediate. The manicured lawns gave way to chain-link fences. The 2-story colonials became modest ranch homes with peeling paint, and the sense of economic comfort that defined my neighborhood disappeared entirely. This was where I truly came alive. Every Saturday morning for 3 years, I had volunteered at the Riverside Community Free Clinic, a modest operation housed in the basement of St. Mary's Lutheran Church on Oak Street. The space was nothing like the sterile, well-equipped hospital where I spent my weekdays. Instead of gleaming medical equipment and endless supplies, we worked with donated materials, second-hand examination tables, and a determination to provide healthcare to families who had been forgotten by our profit-driven medical system. The clinic had been Dr. Patricia Wells' brainchild. She was a retired family physician who had grown frustrated watching patients delay necessary care because they couldn't afford it. Dr. Wells had convinced the church to donate their basement space, and slowly she had assembled a team of volunteer medical professionals who shared her vision of accessible healthcare. There was Jenny Martinez, a nurse practitioner who drove 40 minutes from the neighboring county every weekend, and Dr. Michael Chun, a young resident who sacrificed his only day off to provide pediatric care. Walking down those church basement stairs every Saturday felt like entering a different world, one where medical care was driven by need rather than insurance cards, where we had time to actually listen to our patients' concerns, and where every small victory felt monumental. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow by volunteers, children's artwork decorated the waiting area, and Spanish-language health pamphlets sat alongside English ones to serve our diverse patient population. My typical Saturday would begin at 7 in the morning with Jenny and me setting up examination rooms while Dr. Wells reviewed the appointment schedule. By 8 o'clock, families would already be lined up outside the church, some having walked miles to reach us. These were the working poor of Millbrook, people who earned just enough to disqualify them from government assistance, but nowhere near enough to afford private health care. They were hotel housekeepers, restaurant workers, farm laborers, and single mothers juggling multiple part-time jobs without benefits. I had grown up in a middle-class family where medical care was never questioned. When I felt sick, my mother scheduled a doctor's appointment. When I needed glasses, we visited the optometrist. When I broke my arm playing soccer in high school, we went straight to the emergency room without worrying about the cost. It wasn't until I started volunteering at the clinic that I truly understood what it meant for healthcare to be a luxury rather than a basic human right. The patients who walked through our basement doors carried stories that both broke my heart and inspired my determination. There was Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who cleaned office buildings at night and couldn't afford to miss work for doctor visits during regular business hours. Her youngest daughter, Sophia, had been suffering from chronic asthma, but Maria had been stretching a single inhaler for months because she couldn't afford a refill. When Sophia had her first severe attack, Maria brought her to us in panic, and we were able to provide not just immediate treatment, but also connect her with a prescription assistance program. Then there was Robert Johnson, a 72-year-old retired factory worker whose pension didn't include health benefits. He had been ignoring chest pains for weeks, convinced that he couldn't afford cardiac care. When he finally came to our clinic, pale and sweating during what turned out to be unstable angina, Dr. Wells and I spent hours coordinating his emergency transfer to Cedar Valley Hospital and ensuring he received the life-saving treatment he needed. These weren't just medical cases to me. They were neighbors, community members, and human beings who deserved the same quality of care that I would expect from my own family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every Saturday, I witnessed the profound impact that basic medical attention could have on someone's life. A simple blood pressure check could prevent a stroke. A routine physical could catch diabetes early. An antibiotic could save a child from a dangerous infection. But it wasn't just the medical care that made these Saturdays meaningful. It was the relationships, the trust, and the sense of purpose that filled every moment. Patients would bring their children to show us how much they had grown. Families would update us on job interviews, school graduations, and small celebrations. We became woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that my hospital job, despite its importance, never quite achieved. During the week at Cedar Valley Hospital, I was an excellent nurse who provided professional, competent care within a system that functioned efficiently but sometimes felt impersonal. Patients moved through our units quickly, insurance approvals, dictated treatment plans, and administrative demands often left little time for the kind of personal connection that had drawn me to nursing in the first place. Don't misunderstand me. I loved my hospital work and felt proud of the care we provided, but it was at the clinic where I remembered why I had chosen healthcare as my calling. David had initially been supportive of my volunteer work. When I first started 3 years ago, he had even seemed proud when I told friends and neighbors about the clinic. He would mention it at his business networking events, describing his wife's charitable work with a kind of distant approval. But as the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in his attitude. He would make small comments about my Saturday schedule, wondering aloud why I chose to spend my only full day off working for free. He started planning weekend activities and social events that conflicted with my clinic hours, then expressing disappointment when I couldn't change my commitment. The tension had been building slowly, like a hairline crack in a foundation that gradually weakens the entire structure. David worked long hours building his insurance business, and he valued our comfortable lifestyle, our social standing in the community, and the financial security we had built together. From his perspective, my volunteer work represented time and energy that could be better invested in our own prosperity and social connections. He couldn't understand why I would choose to spend my weekends in a church basement, treating people who couldn't pay when I could be supporting his business networking or enjoying our comfortable life. I tried to explain the fulfillment I found in the clinic work, the desperate need in our community, and the way these Saturday mornings fed my soul in a way that my regular job never quite could. But David saw only the sacrifice without understanding the reward. He saw me leaving our beautiful home to work in a basement. He saw me giving away my professional skills free when we could be building our own wealth. He saw me forming attachments to families whose problems seemed endless and unsolvable. Our conversations about the clinic had become increasingly strained. David would argue that charity was fine, but not at the expense of our own goals and relationships. He would point out that we had our own financial planning to consider, our own social obligations to maintain, and our own marriage to nurture. He wasn't wrong about the time commitment. My Saturdays at the clinic were long and emotionally demanding. I would come home exhausted, sometimes emotionally drained from dealing with heartbreaking cases, and often preoccupied with patient concerns that I couldn't easily set aside. But what David didn't understand was that these Saturday mornings had become essential to my sense of purpose and identity. They reminded me why I had become a nurse in the first place, why I had chosen a profession dedicated to healing and helping others. The clinic work wasn't just charity to me. It was a calling that made me feel more authentically myself than any other aspect of my life. As autumn settled over Millbrook that year, with its familiar parade of red and gold leaves, I had no idea that the foundation of my marriage was about to crumble completely. I was simply living my ordinary life, dividing my time between the professional demands of my hospital job and the passionate commitment of my volunteer work, trying to balance my husband's needs with my own sense of purpose. I thought I could maintain both worlds indefinitely, never imagining that David was reaching a breaking point that would force me to choose between the life I had built and the calling I couldn't abandon. The last normal Saturday morning, I remember, I kissed David goodbye as he slept, grabbed my medical bag, and drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook towards St. Mary's Lutheran Church. The autumn air was crisp, the coffee shops were just opening, and families were starting their weekend routines. I felt grateful for my comfortable life, hopeful about the patients I would see that day, and completely unprepared for the ultimatum that would change everything just 5 days later. The reality of healthcare inequality in Millbrook became impossible to ignore once you stepped foot inside the Riverside Community Free Clinic. What I witnessed every Saturday morning was a microcosm of a broken system that prioritized profit over people, leaving entire families to suffer in silence rather than seek medical care they couldn't afford. Our clinic served a population that existed in a cruel gap between poverty and middle-class stability. These were families who earned too much to qualify for Medicaid, but far too little to afford private insurance or out-of-pocket medical expenses. A single emergency room visit could cost them an entire month's rent. A specialist consultation might require choosing between groceries and healthcare. Prescription medications often became luxury items that families would ration or simply do without. I remember the first time I truly grasped the scope of this problem. It was during my second month of volunteering when Alina Vasquez brought her 4-year-old son, Carlos, to the clinic. Carlos had been running a fever for days, his small body racked with coughing fits that left him gasping for breath. Alina, who worked as a night shift cleaning supervisor at one of the downtown hotels, had waited until her symptoms became terrifying because she knew that a pediatric urgent care visit would cost her nearly $300. When Dr. Wells examined Carlos, she discovered that what had started as a simple cold had developed into pneumonia. The little boy was severely dehydrated. His breathing was labored, and his fever had reached dangerous levels. We immediately provided 4 fluids and antibiotics, but Dr. Wells explained to Elena that Carlos would need follow-up care and possibly chest X-rays to monitor his recovery. Elena's face crumpled as she calculated costs she couldn't afford. She was a devoted mother who had delayed seeking care for her sick child not out of neglect, but out of economic desperation. This scenario repeated itself week after week. We saw diabetic patients who stretched their insulin supplies far beyond safe limits, elderly individuals who cut their heart medications in half to make prescriptions last longer, and parents who brought children with obvious injuries days or weeks after accidents because they had hoped the problems would resolve on their own. The human cost of our healthcare system's failures played out in our church basement every Saturday morning. The geographic divide in Millbrook made these inequalities even more stark. The northern part of town where David and I lived was home to business owners, professionals, and retirees with comprehensive health benefits. These families had established relationships with primary care physicians, regular preventive care, and the financial security to address health issues immediately. Their children received annual physicals, dental cleanings, and any necessary treatments without delay. But cross the railroad tracks that literally divided our town, and you entered a different world entirely. The southern neighborhoods housed the service workers, agricultural laborers, and small-scale manufacturers who kept Millbrook's economy functioning, but rarely shared in its prosperity. These were the families who cleaned the office buildings, prepared food in restaurants, stocked shelves in grocery stores, and provided childcare for more affluent families. Their labor was essential, but their access to healthcare was treated as optional. The Riverside Community Free Clinic had been established specifically to address this gap, but our resources were limited and the need was overwhelming. We operated with donated medical supplies, volunteer staff, and a constant awareness that we were providing Band-Aid solutions to systemic problems. Dr. Wells often said that for every patient we treated, there were probably 5 more who needed care, but didn't know about our services or couldn't arrange transportation to reach us. Our patient population reflected the changing demographics of Millbrook itself. The town had become increasingly diverse over the past decade as agricultural operations expanded and service industries grew. We served recent immigrants who were building new lives in America, multi-generational families whose grandparents had worked in local factories, and young adults who were trying to establish independence despite limited economic opportunities. Language barriers added another layer of complexity to healthcare access. Many of our Spanish-speaking patients had limited English proficiency and felt intimidated by medical environments where they couldn't communicate effectively. Jenny Martinez, our nurse practitioner, was bilingual and often served as both medical provider and cultural interpreter. She would spend extra time explaining diagnoses, treatment plans, and preventive care in ways that respected patients' cultural backgrounds and economic realities. The psychological impact of healthcare insecurity was something I hadn't fully understood before volunteering at the clinic. Patients would arrive apologizing for seeking care, as if their medical needs were impositions rather than basic human requirements. Parents would express guilt about bringing sick children to see us, worried that they were taking resources away from others who might need them more. Elderly patients would minimize their symptoms, downplaying pain or discomfort because they had internalized the message that their healthcare needs were burdens rather than priorities. One Saturday morning, I encountered Martha Williams, a 68-year-old woman who had been experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath for several weeks. Martha had worked as a seamstress at a local textile factory until it closed 5 years earlier, leaving her without employer-sponsored health insurance. She was still 2 years away from Medicare eligibility and couldn't afford private coverage on her limited savings and part-time income from cleaning houses. Martha had been ignoring her symptoms because she was terrified of the financial consequences of cardiac testing. She knew that if she went to the emergency room, the bills could easily reach tens of thousands of dollars. Even if she qualified for payment plans, the debt would consume what little financial security she had managed to maintain. So she had been hoping her symptoms would improve on their own. treating her potential heart condition with over-the-counter pain relievers and prayers. When Dr. Wells examined Martha and heard her describe her symptoms, her expression became grave. She immediately performed an electrocardiogram using our donated equipment and discovered irregularities that suggested Martha was experiencing unstable angina. This was a medical emergency that required immediate cardiac intervention. But Martha's first response was to ask about costs rather than treatment options. Dr. Wells spent nearly an hour on the phone coordinating Martha's emergency transfer to Cedar Valley Hospital while also working with social services to ensure she could access financial assistance programs. We were able to get Martha the immediate care she needed, but the incident highlighted how our broken healthcare system had nearly allowed a preventable cardiac emergency to become a fatal tragedy. These experiences were emotionally exhausting, but also profoundly motivating. Every Saturday, I witnessed the resilience and strength of families who were navigating impossible circumstances with grace and determination. I saw parents who worked multiple jobs to provide for their children, elderly individuals who maintained their dignity despite facing overwhelming challenges, and community members who supported each other through informal networks of care and assistance. The clinic also revealed the interconnected nature of health and social determinants. Patients would arrive with medical conditions that were directly related to their housing situations, work environments, food security, and transportation challenges. A child's asthma might be exacerbated by mold in substandard housing. An adult's diabetes could be complicated by limited access to fresh, affordable food. An elderly person's medication compliance might be affected by their inability to afford transportation to pharmacy appointments. Dr. Wells often reminded our volunteer team that we were treating symptoms of larger systemic problems. While we could provide immediate medical care, we couldn't address the root causes of health inequality that brought patients to our basement clinic. We couldn't raise wages, improve housing conditions, or reform insurance systems. But we could ensure that economic barriers didn't prevent families from receiving basic medical attention when they needed it most. The emotional rewards of this work were immeasurable. When we helped a child recover from an infection, prevented a medical emergency through early intervention, or simply provided reassurance to worried parents, we were participating in healthcare. As it should be, patient-centered and driven by need rather than profit. These Saturday mornings reminded me why I had chosen nursing as my profession and reinforced my belief that healthcare was a fundamental human right rather than a consumer commodity. But the constant exposure to healthcare inequality also generated a persistent sense of frustration and helplessness. I would return home from clinic days feeling emotionally drained by the stories I had heard and the systemic injustices I had witnessed. David would find me quiet and preoccupied, processing the contrast between our comfortable life and the struggles of families just a few miles away who were making impossible choices between medical care and basic necessities. This emotional investment in my volunteer work was beginning to create tension in my marriage, although I didn't fully recognize the extent of the problem at the time. David interpreted my Saturday fatigue and preoccupation as evidence that the clinic work was taking too much out of me. He worried that I was becoming overly involved in other people's problems, and that my emotional well-being was suffering as a result. From his perspective, my volunteer commitment was becoming an unhealthy obsession that was affecting our relationship and my overall happiness. He couldn't understand why I would choose to expose myself to heartbreaking situations when I could spend my weekends relaxing, socializing, or supporting his business development efforts. David saw my clinic work as a drain on my energy and emotional resources rather than a source of purpose and fulfillment. The healthcare system's failures that I witnessed every Saturday were becoming impossible to compartmentalize or ignore. The more I understood about the barriers that prevented families from accessing basic medical care, the more committed I became to providing whatever assistance I could through the clinic. This deepening investment in my volunteer work was setting the stage for a conflict that would ultimately force me to choose between my marriage and my calling to serve others. What I didn't realize at the time was that David was reaching his own breaking point with my Saturday schedule and emotional investment in the clinic. While I was becoming more passionate about addressing healthcare inequality, he was becoming more resentful of the time and energy I devoted to families who couldn't afford to pay for my services. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change both our lives forever. The fragile balance I had been maintaining between my marriage and my volunteer work began to crumble on a cold November evening that started like any other weeknight in our comfortable home on Elm Street. David had arrived home from his insurance office later than usual, carrying the stress of a difficult day in the tense set of his shoulders and the distracted way he responded to my attempts at conversation during dinner. We had been married for 12 years, and I had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods and frustrations. David was methodical and goal-oriented, qualities that had made him successful in building his insurance business from nothing into one of the most respected agencies in Millbrook. He valued efficiency, planning, and measurable results. Our marriage had always functioned smoothly because we generally shared similar values and life goals, or at least I had thought we did. That evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, David broached a subject that had been simmering beneath the surface of our recent conversations. He had been invited to join the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, an opportunity that could significantly expand his business network and community influence. The position would require additional time commitments, including weekend social events, fundraising activities, and regional conferences that often fell on Saturdays. As David explained the opportunity and its potential benefits for his business, I felt a growing sense of unease. I could see where this conversation was heading, and I knew that my Saturday volunteer schedule was about to become a point of contention. David's voice carried an edge of frustration as he pointed out that my clinic commitment would prevent me from accompanying him to many of the Chamber's weekend events, undermining his ability to present himself as a successful businessman with a supportive wife. The expectations of our social circle had always included the assumption that spouses would actively support each other's professional advancement. Business dinners, networking events, and community functions were considered joint obligations that strengthened both personal relationships and career prospects. My absence from these activities hadn't been problematic when David's business was smaller and less visible, but his growing success was creating new social expectations that my volunteer schedule made difficult to fulfill. David's frustration extended beyond just the weekend scheduling conflicts. He had begun to question the wisdom of my emotional investment in families whose problems seemed endless and unsolvable. From his perspective, I was allowing other people's hardships to affect my own well-being and our marriage's stability. He would point out that I often returned from clinic days emotionally drained, preoccupied with patient concerns, and less available for the kind of relaxed, intimate conversations that had characterized our earlier years together. The tension came to a head when David received an invitation to a regional insurance conference scheduled for the same weekend as the clinic's annual health fair, an event I had been planning for months. The health fair was our biggest outreach effort of the year, providing free screenings, vaccinations, and health education to hundreds of community members who rarely had access to preventive care. I had coordinated with local pharmacies to provide medication samples, arranged for specialists to volunteer their time, and organized health education workshops in both English and Spanish. David's conference represented a significant professional opportunity that could lead to new business partnerships and expanded market reach. Attending with him would demonstrate my support for his career advancement and our shared commitment to building our financial future. The conference included spouse activities, networking receptions, and social events that were designed to strengthen business relationships through personal connections. The conflict between these two Saturday Commitments forced us to confront the fundamental differences in how we prioritized our time, energy, and values. David couldn't understand why I would choose to spend our weekend providing free medical services to people who couldn't afford to pay when I could be supporting his business development efforts that would benefit our own financial security. From his perspective, my volunteer work was a luxury we could no longer afford as his business reached a new level of success and community visibility. I tried to explain to David why the health fair was so important, not just to me personally, but to the families who depended on our services. This was their one opportunity each year to receive comprehensive health screenings that could detect serious conditions early enough for effective treatment. We had patients who had been diagnosed with diabetes, hypertension, and even cancer. During previous health fairs, diagnoses that had literally saved their lives because they couldn't afford regular preventive care. But David's response revealed a fundamental disconnect in how we viewed the purpose and value of my volunteer work. He argued that there were other medical professionals who could staff the health fair, other volunteers who could take on the coordination responsibilities I had assumed. He pointed out that my nursing skills would be just as valuable whether I used them to support his business networking or to provide charity care, but only one of these choices would benefit our own family's future. The conversation became increasingly heated as we each defended our positions with growing frustration and diminishing patience. David accused me of prioritizing strangers over my own husband, of being more committed to other people's families than to building our own prosperity and security. He suggested that my volunteer work had become an obsession that was damaging our marriage and preventing us from achieving the social and financial success that should be our primary focus. I found myself defending not just my Saturday schedule, but my entire sense of purpose and identity. The clinic work wasn't just volunteer activity to me. It was a calling that connected me to the values that had originally drawn me to nursing. I couldn't explain to David how it felt to see a child recover from illness because their family finally had access to medical care, or how meaningful it was to provide dignity and respect to patients who had been treated as charity cases by the traditional healthcare system. Our argument that night ended without resolution, but it marked a turning point in our marriage that neither of us could ignore. David had made it clear that he viewed my volunteer work as a competing priority that was undermining our shared goals and relationship. I realized that what I considered my most meaningful contribution to our community was seen by my husband as a selfish indulgence that was harming our marriage. The following week passed in an atmosphere of tense politeness. As we both processed the implications of our conflict, David continued planning for the insurance conference while making pointed comments about the professional opportunities I was forcing him to sacrifice. I maintained my preparation for the health fair while feeling increasingly isolated in my commitment to the clinic and its patients. The stakes of our disagreement became even clearer when David's business partner, Michael Stevens, invited us to dinner to celebrate a major client acquisition. During the meal, Michael's wife, Jennifer, mentioned her own volunteer work with the Millbrook Historical Society, describing it as a pleasant social activity that enhanced her husband's community profile, while providing enjoyable weekend activities for their family. The contrast between Jennifer's volunteer experience and my own was striking and illuminating. Her historical society work involved organizing fundraising galas, coordinating with other affluent community members, and planning events that strengthened social connections within Millbrook's business community. Her volunteer activities complemented and supported her husband's professional goals, while providing opportunities for the kind of networking and relationship building that enhanced their family's social standing. David's pointed looks and comments during that dinner made it clear that he viewed Jennifer's approach to community service as a model I should consider adopting. Her volunteer work enhanced rather than complicated her marriage, supported rather than competed with her husband's business goals, and provided social benefits that strengthened their family's position in the community. But I couldn't imagine abandoning the families who depended on the clinic for their basic healthcare needs in order to plan historical society fundraisers for people who already had access to comprehensive medical care. The thought of choosing social networking over medical necessity felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about the purpose of healthcare and my responsibility as a nurse. The tension between David and me continued to escalate over the following weeks as the dates of both the conference and health fair approached. Our conversations became increasingly strained as we both recognized that this conflict represented more than just a scheduling disagreement. We were confronting fundamental differences in our values, priorities, and vision for our marriage's future direction. David began making subtle but persistent comments about other couples in our social circle who had built successful businesses and prominent community positions through mutual support and shared priorities. He would mention wives who had given up time-consuming volunteer commitments to focus on supporting their husband's career advancement, presenting these choices as examples of marital wisdom and practical decision-making. Meanwhile, I found myself increasingly anxious about the prospect of disappointing the clinic patients and volunteers who were counting on the health fair's success. Dr. Wells had been coordinating with community organizations to ensure maximum attendance. Jenny Martinez had arranged for specialists to provide free consultations, and dozens of families had already scheduled appointments for services they couldn't afford to receive anywhere else. The personal stakes of this conflict were becoming clear to both David and me. This wasn't just about one weekend or one event, but about the fundamental direction of our marriage and our individual identities within that relationship. David was asking me to choose between my calling to serve others and my commitment to POVA, supporting his professional ambitions. I was being forced to decide whether my sense of purpose and fulfillment was worth risking the security and partnership of my 12-year marriage. As the weekend of both events approached, neither David nor I was willing to compromise our position. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force me to make a choice that would change everything about my life, my marriage, and my understanding of what it meant to honor both my personal values and my commitment to the person I loved most in the world. The ultimatum came on a Friday evening in late November, delivered with the same methodical precision that David brought to every important business decision. He had obviously been planning this conversation, choosing his words carefully and timing the discussion to ensure I understood the seriousness of his position. We were sitting in our living room, the space where we had shared countless comfortable evenings over 12 years of marriage, but the atmosphere was charged with tension that made even familiar surroundings feel foreign and threatening. David had just returned from a Chamber of Commerce planning meeting, and his mood carried the weight of professional pressures and social expectations that had been building for months. He poured himself a glass of wine, something he rarely did on weeknight evenings, and settled into his favorite armchair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for an important negotiation. The conversation began with David outlining the specific opportunities that my volunteer schedule was preventing him from pursuing. The insurance conference I would miss by attending the health fair included networking sessions with potential business partners from across the Midwest. There were contract opportunities worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that could be decided through the personal relationships formed during conference social events. His potential appointment to the Chamber of Commerce Board was being reconsidered because committee members questioned his commitment to community business development. As David spoke, I realized that he had been keeping a detailed mental inventory of every professional opportunity that my Saturday clinic work had complicated or prevented. He mentioned business dinners I had missed because I was exhausted from clinic days, networking events I had skipped because they conflicted with my volunteer schedule, and social gatherings where my absence had been noticed and commented upon by other business leaders' wives. The picture he painted was of a successful man whose professional advancement was being undermined by his wife's refusal to prioritize their shared interests over her personal volunteer commitments. David's voice remained calm and controlled, but I could hear the frustration and resentment that had been accumulating over months of what he perceived as my selfish choices and misplaced priorities. He explained that he had reached a point where he could no longer accept the limitations that my clinic work placed on our marriage and his business development. The weekend scheduling conflicts were just the visible symptoms of a deeper problem that was affecting every aspect of our relationship. David felt that I had become emotionally unavailable, distracted by other people's problems, and unwilling to invest in building the kind of life we had originally planned together. From David's perspective, my volunteer work represented a fundamental rejection of our shared values and goals. We had spent years building financial security, establishing ourselves in Millbrook's business community, and creating a comfortable lifestyle that many couples would envy. My insistence on spending weekends providing free medical care to people who couldn't afford to pay seemed to him like a rejection of everything we had worked to achieve. David's voice became more intense as he described feeling like a single person trying to build a business while carrying the social burden of explaining his wife's absence from important community events. Other business leaders' wives were active participants in their husbands' professional development, organizing social gatherings, maintaining community relationships, and presenting themselves as unified teams working towards shared success. Contrast between those marriages and our own was becoming a source of professional embarrassment that David could no longer tolerate. He felt that my clinic commitment was making him appear less successful, less supported, and less worthy of the business opportunities and community leadership positions he was seeking to achieve. As David outlined his grievances, I found myself torn between understanding his frustration and feeling defensive about work that had become central to my sense of purpose and identity. I could see how my Saturday absences affected our social obligations and limited David's networking opportunities. I understood that business success often depended on personal relationships that were built through shared social activities and community involvement. But I also knew that David didn't truly understand what my clinic work meant to me or to the families who depended on our services. He saw only the sacrifice and limitation without recognizing the fulfillment and purpose that made those sacrifices meaningful. David couldn't comprehend how it felt to provide medical care to children whose families had been going without treatment, or to offer dignity and respect to patients who had been treated as charity cases by the traditional healthcare system. The conversation continued with David presenting what he called a reasonable compromise. He suggested that I could maintain my nursing skills and community involvement by volunteering with organizations that better aligned with our social circle and business interests. The Millbrook Hospital Foundation was seeking volunteers for their annual fundraising gala, an event that would allow me to use my medical background while building relationships with affluent community members who could become potential insurance clients. David pointed out that other healthcare professionals' wives had found ways to contribute to their community while supporting their husband's business development. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, married to one of Cedar Valley Hospital's lead surgeons, organized medical charity events that raised significant funds while providing excellent networking opportunities for her husband's practice. Susan Richards, whose husband owned the largest medical equipment company in the region, served on healthcare foundation boards that enhanced both her family's social standing and her husband's business connections. These women had found ways to channel their interests in healthcare and community service into activities that complemented rather than competed with their husband's professional goals. David couldn't understand why I insisted on working in a church basement with uninsured patients when I could be organizing fundraising events with community leaders who could advance both our social standing and his business prospects. But the suggestion felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything I believed about the purpose of healthcare and my responsibility as a nurse. The hospital foundation gala would raise money for equipment purchases and facility improvements that would primarily benefit patients who already had comprehensive insurance coverage. The fundraising events David was suggesting would help wealthy community members feel good about their charitable contributions, while doing nothing to address the healthcare access problems that brought families to our clinic every Saturday. As our conversation became more heated, David's frustration finally erupted into the ultimatum that would change everything between us. His voice became sharp and final as he delivered words that I will never forget. "Lisa, I can't continue this way. You need to choose what's more important to you, your marriage or your charity work. I'm not asking you to stop being a nurse or stop caring about people, but I need a wife who supports our shared goals instead of constantly choosing other people's needs over our own family's future." The silence that followed David's ultimatum felt crushing and infinite. I sat in our comfortable living room, surrounded by 12 years of shared memories and accumulated possessions, realizing that everything I had believed about our marriage and our mutual understanding was crumbling around me. David was asking me to abandon work that had become essential to my sense of purpose and identity, work that served families whose basic healthcare needs would go unmet without the clinic services. But I also knew that David wasn't entirely wrong about the impact of my volunteer work on our marriage and his professional development. My Saturday clinic commitment did limit our social activities and networking opportunities. I was often emotionally exhausted after clinic days, less available for the kind of intimate conversations and shared relaxation that had characterized our earlier years together. My growing passion for addressing healthcare inequality had created a divide between us that neither of us had fully acknowledged until this moment. David's ultimatum forced me to confront the reality that I couldn't continue trying to maintain both my marriage and my volunteer commitment without making a definitive choice about my priorities and values. The comfortable compromise I had been attempting was satisfying neither my husband's needs for support and partnership, nor my own calling to serve families who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. The weight of this decision felt overwhelming as I considered what each choice would mean for my future and my sense of self. Choosing my marriage would mean abandoning families like the Vasquez family, whose son Carlos had nearly died from pneumonia because they couldn't afford medical care. It would mean walking away from patients like Martha Williams, whose heart condition had been ignored because she was terrified of the financial consequences of cardiac testing. But choosing the clinic would mean ending my 12-year marriage to a man I still loved, losing the financial security and social standing we had built together, and facing an uncertain future as a single woman starting over in her mid-30s. David wasn't bluffing or trying to manipulate me. He was simply stating his limits and expectations with the same clarity he brought to every important business decision. As I sat in the silence following David's ultimatum, I realized that this moment would define not just my marriage, but my entire understanding of who I was and what I believed was most important in life. The choice between my husband's needs and my calling to serve others would determine everything about my future, and I had until Saturday morning to decide which path I would take. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made every breath feel sharp and clarifying, but I woke with a weight in my chest that no amount of fresh air could alleviate. David's ultimatum had consumed my thoughts for the entire night, leaving me exhausted and emotionally raw as I faced the decision that would define everything about my future. David was already gone when I woke up. He had left early for a golf meeting with potential business clients, a strategic networking opportunity that exemplified the kind of weekend activities he wanted me to prioritize. His absence felt both relief and abandonment, giving me space to think while also underscoring how isolated I had become in this impossible choice between my marriage and my calling. I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the volunteer schedule that had been posted on our refrigerator for months. The annual health fair was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock, And dozens of families were counting on the free medical services that our clinic provided just once each year. Dr. Wells had coordinated with specialists who were donating their Saturday to provide consultations that these families could never afford through traditional healthcare channels. The logistics of the health fair represented months of planning and coordination that couldn't be easily replaced or rescheduled. We had arranged for free mammogram screenings, diabetic testing supplies, blood pressure monitoring, and childhood immunizations that were desperately needed in our community. Local pharmacies had donated medication samples, and community organizations had helped spread word about the event to families who rarely had access to preventive health care. But I also knew that David was serious about his ultimatum. He had spoken with the clarity and finality that characterized his most important business decisions, and I understood that choosing the clinic over his conference would likely end our marriage. David had reached his limit with what he perceived as my selfish prioritization of other people's needs over our own relationship and shared goals. As I sat with my coffee, trying to process the magnitude of this choice, I found myself thinking about individual patients who would be affected by my decision. Maria Santos had scheduled her 3 children for immunization updates that were required for school enrollment, but too expensive for her single mother budget. Robert Thompson, the elderly man with chest pain who had finally agreed to cardiac screening, was planning to attend specifically because he trusted me to coordinate his care with appropriate specialists. These weren't abstract considerations, but real people whose health and well-being would be directly impacted by whether I chose to honor my commitment to the clinic or my obligation to support David's professional development. The thought of disappointing families who had been planning for months to receive medical care they couldn't afford elsewhere felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about the purpose of healthcare and my responsibility as a nurse. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the legitimate concerns that David had raised about our marriage and our shared future. His business was reaching a level of success that required new kinds of social and professional commitments, and my volunteer schedule was genuinely limiting his ability to pursue opportunities that could significantly improve our financial security and community standing. I understood that other wives in our social circle had found ways to support their husbands' professional advancement while maintaining their own interests and community involvement. David wasn't asking me to become a passive housewife with no outside commitments, but rather to align my volunteer activities with goals that would benefit our marriage and his business development. The rational part of my mind recognized that David's position wasn't unreasonable or selfish. Marriage required compromise and mutual support, and I had been unwilling to modify my volunteer commitment even when it clearly interfered with important opportunities for our shared future. A mature, responsible wife would find ways to contribute to her community while prioritizing her husband's needs and their joint financial goals. But as I sat in our comfortable kitchen, surrounded by the material evidence of our successful partnership, I couldn't shake the feeling that choosing David's conference over the health fair would represent a fundamental betrayal of my values and my purpose as a healthcare professional. The families who depended on our clinic weren't abstract beneficiaries of my charitable impulses, but real people whose basic medical needs would go unmet without the services we provided. The internal struggle felt like being torn between 2 different versions of myself. There was the responsible wife who should support her husband's professional advancement and prioritize their shared financial security and social standing. And there was the nurse who had taken an oath to serve patients regardless of their ability to pay, who believed that healthcare was a fundamental human right rather than a consumer commodity. As 8 o'clock approached, I realized that continuing to sit in my kitchen would eventually constitute a choice by default. If I didn't leave for the clinic soon, I would be choosing David's conference and our marriage over the health fair, and the families who were counting on my participation. The decision was being forced by the passage of time and the logistics of Saturday. morning commitments that couldn't be delayed indefinitely. I found myself moving through our house like someone in a dream, gathering my medical supplies and volunteer materials while feeling disconnected from my own actions. Part of me hoped that David would return home and offer some kind of compromise that would allow me to honor both commitments, but I knew that he had already made his position clear and that such a compromise was unlikely to emerge. The drive to St. Mary's Lutheran Church felt longer than usual, each familiar landmark serving as a reminder of the choice I was making and its potential consequences. I passed the bank where David had first established his business credit, the restaurant where we had celebrated our wedding anniversary just 2 months earlier, and the subdivision where several of his most important clients lived in comfortable prosperity. But I also drove through the neighborhoods where our clinic patients lived, past the apartment complexes and modest homes where families were preparing for their annual opportunity to receive comprehensive health care at no cost. These were the streets where children played with untreated injuries because their parents couldn't afford urgent care visits, where elderly residents managed chronic conditions without regular medical monitoring because specialist consultations were financially impossible. When I pulled into the church parking lot and saw Dr. Wells and Jenny Martinez setting up screening stations in the crisp morning air, I realized that I had made my choice through my actions rather than through any moment of decisive clarity. I was here, at the clinic, preparing to provide medical care to families who had nowhere else to turn, and that meant I was choosing my calling over my marriage. The weight of this decision felt both liberating and terrifying as I gathered my supplies and walked toward the church basement, where dozens of families would soon arrive seeking medical care they couldn't afford elsewhere. I was crossing a threshold that would change everything about my life, choosing compassion over comfort and service over security. But I still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what I was sacrificing, or what consequences would follow from this moment of moral clarity. Dr. Wells greeted me with relief and gratitude, unaware of the personal crisis that had nearly prevented my participation in the health fair. As we completed our preparations for the day ahead, I tried to focus on the medical needs we would address and the families we would serve, pushing aside thoughts about David's reaction and the future of our marriage that I was placing in jeopardy. With every minute I remained at the clinic, the first families began arriving before 9 o'clock, and I lost myself in the familiar rhythm of medical assessment, patient education, and compassionate care that had always made my volunteer work feel more like a calling than a choice. But even as I focused on providing the best possible healthcare to people who desperately needed it, I couldn't escape the knowledge that I had just made a decision that would change everything about my life in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend. The health fair unfolded with an intensity and emotional weight that I had never experienced in 3 years of volunteering at the Riverside Community Free Clinic. Perhaps it was because I knew that this might be my last day serving these families, or perhaps the gravity of my choice to be here despite David's ultimatum had heightened my awareness of every interaction, every moment of connection with the patients who trusted us with their most vulnerable concerns. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the church basement was buzzing with activity that felt both chaotic and deeply purposeful. Families filled every corner of our makeshift medical facility, speaking in hushed tones as they waited for services they had been anticipating for months. The air was thick with nervous energy, hope, and the kind of quiet desperation that comes from people who rarely have access to the healthcare they desperately need. I found myself working alongside Dr. Wells at the cardiac screening station, where we were providing electrocardiograms and blood pressure monitoring for adults who couldn't afford regular cardiovascular care. The equipment we were using had been donated by Cedar Valley Hospital's cardiology department, and Dr. Richard Martinez, one of the region's most respected cardiologists, had volunteered his Saturday morning to interpret results and provide consultations. It was at this station that I encountered a situation that would haunt my thoughts for weeks, afterward and crystallize everything I understood about why this work mattered so profoundly. A woman named Catherine Torres approached our screening area with the hesitant movements of someone who wasn't sure she belonged there, despite having every right to the care we were providing. Catherine was 43 years old, a mother of 2 teenage daughters who worked as a hotel housekeeper at one of the chain properties near the interstate. She had been experiencing episodes of chest tightness and dizziness for several months, symptoms that terrified her but that she had been ignoring because she knew that cardiac testing could easily cost thousands of dollars that she simply didn't have. As I attached the electrocardiogram leads to Catherine's chest, she confided that she had been putting off seeking medical care, not just because of the cost, but because she was afraid of what we might find. Her mother had died of heart disease at 52, and Catherine lived with the constant fear that she might be developing the same condition. But even more terrifying than the possibility of heart disease was the certainty that medical bills could destroy her family's precarious financial stability. Catherine worked 40 hours per week cleaning hotel rooms, physically demanding labor that left her exhausted and sometimes short of breath. Her husband, Miguel, worked construction when weather and availability allowed, but his income was sporadic and seasonal. Together, they earned just enough to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and their daughter's school expenses, with no margin for medical emergencies or preventive care. The Torres family represented everything that was broken about our healthcare system and everything that made our clinics work essential. Catherine was a hardworking woman who contributed to our community's economy and raised 2 academically successful daughters. But she had been going without basic medical care because she couldn't afford the cost of diagnosis and treatment for potentially serious cardiac symptoms. When Dr. Martinez reviewed Catherine's electrocardiogram, his expression became serious in a way that made my heart skip a beat. The test showed irregularities that suggested significant heart rhythm problems, abnormalities that required immediate follow-up care, and probably medication management. This wasn't a case where we could provide reassurance and general health advice. This was a medical emergency that had been developing silently for months because Catherine couldn't afford to seek help. Dr. Martinez spent nearly 30 minutes explaining Catherine's test results, the importance of immediate cardiac care, and the treatment options that would be necessary to manage her condition. He spoke with the patience and thoroughness that characterized the best of medical practice, ensuring that Catherine understood both the seriousness of her situation and the effectiveness of available treatments. But even as Dr. Martinez outlined the medical interventions that could protect Catherine's health and potentially save her life, I could see the panic building in her eyes as she calculated costs that would be impossible for her family to manage. Cardiac medications could cost hundreds of dollars per month. Follow-up appointments with specialists would require taking time off work that she couldn't afford to lose. Advanced testing procedures could generate bills that would exceed her family's annual income. Catherine's response to her diagnosis was heartbreaking and illuminating. Instead of expressing relief that we had identified a treatable condition, instead of asking about treatment options or prognosis, her first question was whether there were any free or low-cost programs that could help her afford the cardiac care she needed. She apologized repeatedly for taking up our time with problems she wasn't sure she could afford to address properly. Dr. Martinez and I spent the next hour coordinating Catherine's transition to ongoing cardiac care, working with social services representatives and pharmaceutical assistance programs to ensure she could access the treatment she needed without destroying her family's financial stability. We were able to connect her with a cardiologist who participated in a sliding scale payment program, arrange for free medication samples to get her started on necessary treatments, and schedule follow-up appointments that would monitor her condition. But even as we solved the immediate crisis and established a care plan that Catherine could afford, I was struck by the realization that her situation was being replicated throughout our clinic that morning. Every screening station was identifying serious medical conditions that had been ignored or inadequately treated because families couldn't afford regular health care. Every volunteer was coordinating emergency interventions for problems that could have been prevented or managed more effectively with earlier access to medical care. At the diabetes screening station, Jenny Martinez was working with a 58-year-old man named Fernando Silva, whose blood sugar levels were dangerously elevated, indicating uncontrolled diabetes that was putting him at risk for heart disease, kidney damage, and vision problems. Fernando had been rationing his insulin for months, taking smaller doses than prescribed, because he couldn't afford regular prescription refills. The pediatric vaccination station was overwhelmed with families whose children were behind on immunizations. Not because of vaccine hesitancy, but because they couldn't afford the cost of well-child visits where vaccinations would normally be administered. Dr. Patricia Chen, a pediatrician who had driven from the neighboring county to volunteer, was working frantically to provide catch-up immunizations that would protect children from preventable diseases. The Women's Health Screening Area, staffed by Dr. Sarah Williams from the Regional Planned Parenthood Clinic, was providing cervical cancer screenings for women who hadn't had pap smears in years because they couldn't afford gynecological care. Dr. Williams had already identified several cases of abnormal cervical cells that required immediate follow-up, potentially preventing cervical cancer in women who might never have received screening through traditional healthcare channels. Every corner of our clinic was revealing the devastating human cost of healthcare inequality in ways that were both heartbreaking and motivating. We were providing life-saving medical interventions to people who had been suffering in silence, identifying serious conditions that could be effectively treated if patients could access ongoing care, and offering hope to families who had resigned themselves to declining health because medical care seemed financially impossible. But the emotional intensity of these encounters was taking a toll on all of our volunteers. Dr. Wells looked exhausted by midday, not from the physical demands of providing medical care, but from the emotional weight of seeing so much preventable suffering and unmet need. Jenny Martinez was working with tears in her eyes as she coordinated care for patients whose medical conditions had deteriorated significantly during months or years of delayed treatment. As for me, I found myself completely absorbed in the medical needs surrounding me while simultaneously processing the knowledge that I was sacrificing my marriage for the opportunity to provide this care. Every patient interaction reinforced my conviction that this work was essential and meaningful, but I couldn't escape the awareness that David was probably discovering my absence from his conference and drawing conclusions about my priorities that would likely end our relationship. The contrast between the immediate, tangible impact of our clinic work and the abstract nature of David's business networking felt stark and clarifying. Here in the church basement, we were literally saving lives, preventing medical emergencies, and providing hope to families who had been abandoned by our profit-driven healthcare system. David's conference, while important for his business development, was focused on building relationships that would primarily benefit people who already had comprehensive insurance coverage and financial security. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as the health fair was beginning to wind down, I encountered a situation that would stay with me forever and crystallize everything I understood about the choice I had made that morning. A young mother named Rosa Mendoza arrived with her 6-year-old daughter, Isabella, who had been experiencing severe headaches and vision problems for several weeks. Rosa worked as a night shift cleaning supervisor at an office complex, a job that provided just enough income to disqualify her family from Medicaid, but nowhere near enough to afford private health insurance or specialist consultations. She had been treating Isabella's symptoms with over-the-counter pain relievers and hoping they would resolve on their own. But the child's condition had been worsening to the point where Rosa was terrified that something serious was wrong. When Dr. Chen examined Isabella, she immediately identified signs that suggested increased intracranial pressure, a potentially life-threatening condition that required emergency neurological evaluation. The little girl's symptoms could indicate anything from a treatable sinus infection to a brain tumor, but determining the cause would require CT scan imaging and specialist consultation that Rosa couldn't afford. The panic in Rosa's eyes as Dr. Chun explained the seriousness of Isabella's symptoms was devastating to witness. Here was a devoted mother who had been trying to provide for her daughter's medical needs within the constraints of an impossible financial situation. And now she was facing the prospect that her child might have a serious neurological condition that had been developing while she waited for symptoms to improve on their own. Dr. Chun immediately began coordinating Isabella's emergency transfer to Cedar Valley Hospital's pediatric unit, while also working with social services to ensure the family could access financial assistance for the extensive medical workup that would be necessary. We were able to arrange for immediate evaluation and treatment regardless of the family's ability to pay. But Rosa's terror and guilt over having delayed seeking care was heartbreaking to witness. As I helped coordinate Isabella's transfer and provided emotional support to Rosa during those frightening moments, I realized that this was exactly why I couldn't abandon my volunteer work, regardless of the personal cost. This little girl's life might depend on the connections and advocacy that our clinic provided to families who had nowhere else to turn when medical emergencies arose. The intensity of that afternoon reinforced everything I believed about the importance of healthcare as a human right rather than a consumer commodity. We had identified dozens of serious medical conditions that had been ignored or inadequately treated because of financial barriers, provided life-saving interventions to people who might never have received care through traditional channels, and offered hope and dignity to families who had been treated as charity cases by the broader healthcare system. But even as I felt more committed than ever to the clinic's mission, I couldn't ignore the reality that my choice to be there was probably destroying my marriage and fundamentally altering the trajectory of my life. David's ultimatum had been clear and final, and by choosing the health fair over his conference, I had made a decision that would likely end our 12-year partnership and force me to rebuild my life from scratch. As the health fair concluded and we began cleaning up our makeshift medical facility, I felt simultaneously fulfilled by the work we had accomplished and terrified by the personal consequences I would face when I returned home that evening. Choice I had made felt morally clear and professionally necessary, but it also felt like stepping off a cliff into an uncertain future that I wasn't sure I was prepared to navigate alone. The final hours of the health fair stretched into the late afternoon, and despite my exhaustion from the emotionally intense day, I found myself reluctant to leave the church basement, where we had provided so much needed care to our community's most vulnerable families. Each patient interaction had reinforced my conviction that this work was not just meaningful, but essential, creating a stark contrast with David's perception of my volunteer commitment as a selfish indulgence that was harming our marriage. As we began the process of cleaning up our screening stations and packing donated medical supplies, Dr. Wells approached me with an expression of gratitude and concern that suggested she had sensed the personal turmoil underlying my participation. In the day's events, Patricia Wells had been my mentor and inspiration since I first started volunteering at the clinic, and she possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of people that made her an exceptional physician and a trusted friend. Dr. Wells asked if I had a few minutes to talk privately, and we walked together to a quiet corner of the church basement where we could speak without being overheard by other volunteers who were still coordinating patient follow-up care. Her question was simple and direct in the way that characterized her approach to both medical practice and personal relationships. "Lisa, is everything all right? You seem to be carrying some heavy concerns today, and I want to make sure you're getting the support you need." The compassion in Dr. Wells' voice almost broke down the emotional barriers I had been maintaining throughout the day. For the first time since David's ultimatum, I found myself able to articulate the impossible choice I was facing, and the personal cost of my decision to prioritize the clinic over my marriage. As I explained the conflict between David's professional needs and my volunteer commitment, Dr. Wells listened with the same focused attention she brought to patient consultations. When I finished describing David's ultimatum and my choice to attend the health fair despite his clear expectations, Dr. Wells was quiet for several moments before responding with characteristic wisdom and insight. She told me that she had faced similar choices early in her medical career, when the demands of patient care sometimes conflicted with family expectations and social obligations. The tension between professional calling and personal relationships was something that many healthcare providers navigated, particularly women who were expected to balance career ambitions with traditional domestic responsibilities. But Dr. Wells also reminded me that the choice I had made was about more than just my volunteer schedule or my marriage dynamics. By choosing to provide medical care to families who had nowhere else to turn, I was honoring the fundamental purpose of healthcare and the oath I had taken as a nurse to serve patients regardless of their ability to pay. The families we had helped today would carry the impact of our care far beyond the immediate medical interventions we had provided. As Dr. Wells and I talked, other volunteers joined our conversation, creating an impromptu debriefing session about the day's accomplishments and the ongoing challenges facing our community's healthcare access. Jenny Martinez shared stories about patients she had treated who were managing chronic conditions without regular medical monitoring because specialist consultations were financially impossible. Dr. Martinez described the number of cardiac patients he had encountered who were at serious risk for heart attacks or strokes because they couldn't afford preventive care. The collective impact of our health fair was staggering when we considered the individual stories and medical interventions that had taken place throughout the day. We had provided comprehensive care to over 200 community members, identified dozens of serious medical conditions that required follow-up treatment, and connected families with resources and assistance programs that would help them access ongoing healthcare services. But more than the medical statistics, we had offered dignity, respect, and hope to people who had been marginalized by our profit-driven healthcare system. We had treated patients as whole human beings rather than insurance claims, taken time to listen to their concerns and fears, and provided care that was driven by need rather than ability to pay. This was healthcare as it should be, patient-centered, and guided by compassion rather than commercial considerations. As evening approached and we completed our cleanup efforts, I realized that my decision to attend the health fair had been about more than just honoring my volunteer commitment or defying David's ultimatum. It had been an affirmation of my values, my professional identity, and my understanding of what it meant to serve others through healthcare. I couldn't have chosen differently without betraying everything I believed about the purpose of nursing and my responsibility to vulnerable populations. The drive home through Millbrook's quiet Saturday evening streets felt like traveling between two different worlds. I passed the comfortable neighborhoods where David and I lived, where families were probably enjoying leisurely dinners and weekend relaxation, oblivious to the medical crises that had been addressed just a few miles away. In the church basement, the contrast between these two realities, the prosperous north side and the struggling south side of our community, had become impossible for me to ignore or accept. When I pulled into our driveway on Elm Street, I noticed that David's car was already there, which meant he had returned from his insurance conference and was probably waiting to discuss my choice and its implications for our marriage. The house looked the same as it had that morning, with its well-maintained lawn and comfortable suburban appearance. But I knew that everything about our relationship had fundamentally changed because of the decision I had made. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering courage for the conversation that would determine the future of our 12-year marriage. I thought about Catherine Torres and her cardiac condition that might have remained undiagnosed for months longer if she hadn't been able to access our free screening services. I remembered Rosa Mendoza's terror when she realized her daughter's headaches might indicate a serious neurological condition that required immediate medical attention. These families and dozens of others like them had been able to receive essential healthcare because volunteers like me were willing to sacrifice our Saturday mornings to provide services that the traditional medical system had made financially impossible. The thought of abandoning this work to focus on David's business networking and social obligations felt like a betrayal of everything I understood about the purpose of healthcare and my calling as a nurse. But I also knew that David's concerns about our marriage and his professional development weren't unreasonable or selfish. He had every right to expect his wife's support for his business advancement, and my volunteer commitment was genuinely limiting his opportunities for the kind of networking and relationship building that could significantly improve our financial security and social standing. The conflict between these competing obligations felt impossible to resolve through compromise or negotiation. David needed a wife who would prioritize their shared goals and his professional development, while I needed to honor my commitment to serving families who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. These weren't positions that could be easily reconciled or balanced. They represented fundamentally different understandings of what should take priority in our lives. As I finally gathered my medical supplies and walked toward our front door, I realized that my choice to attend the health fair had been as much about defining my own identity and values as it had been about providing medical care to vulnerable families. I couldn't abandon my volunteer work without losing an essential part of myself, the part that had drawn me to nursing in the first place, and that found meaning in serving others regardless of their ability to pay. The house was quiet when I entered, but I could see lights on in David's home office, which suggested he was probably working or reviewing materials from his conference. The normalcy of our familiar surroundings felt strange and disorienting after the intensity of the day at the clinic, like returning to a place that no longer quite fit the person I was becoming. I set my medical bag down in the hallway and took a deep breath, preparing for the conversation that would either end our marriage or force us to find some way to bridge the fundamental differences that my choice had revealed. I knew that David was unlikely to be angry or dramatic. His approach to difficult conversations was typically measured and businesslike, but I also knew that his position had been clearly stated and that my defiance of his ultimatum would probably be met with the consequences he had promised. As I walked toward David's office, I carried with me the knowledge that I had spent the day providing essential medical care to families who desperately needed it, that I had honored my commitment to serving others despite the personal cost, and that I had remained true to the values that had originally drawn me to healthcare as a profession. Whatever consequences followed from my choice, I would face them with the conviction that I had done what was right, even when it was difficult and painful. The decision I had made felt both liberating and terrifying, marking the end of one chapter of my life and the uncertain beginning of another. I had chosen compassion over comfort, service over security, and my calling over my marriage. And now I would discover what price such choices demanded and what possibilities they might create for a future I couldn't yet imagine. David was sitting at his desk when I knocked softly on his office door, his laptop open to what appeared to be a detailed summary of the insurance conference I had missed. He looked up at me with an expression that was neither angry nor surprised, but rather resigned and sad in a way that made my heart sink. This wasn't the face of a man preparing for an argument, but rather someone who had already processed my choice and reached conclusions about what it meant for our marriage. He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I had sat dozens of times over the years when we discussed household finances, vacation plans, or major life decisions. But the atmosphere this evening was charged with finality and disappointment that made even familiar surroundings feel foreign and uncomfortable. David's voice was calm and controlled when he finally spoke, carrying the same professional tone he used for difficult business negotiations. He had obviously spent considerable time during his conference thinking about our relationship and my priorities, and he had reached conclusions that he was prepared to communicate with characteristic directness and clarity. He began by acknowledging that my choice to attend the health fair rather than accompany him to the conference had provided a clear answer to the ultimatum he had delivered Friday evening. My actions had demonstrated that I valued my volunteer work more than his professional development and our marriage's future, and he respected my right to make that choice, even though he couldn't accept its implications for our relationship. David explained that he had spent portions of the conference discussing his situation with colleagues whose wives actively supported their business development efforts. He had been embarrassed to explain my absence and frustrated by the missed opportunities for relationship building that could have benefited both his career advancement and our financial security. The contrast between his marriage and those of his professional peers had become too stark and problematic to ignore or tolerate. From David's perspective, my volunteer commitment represented a fundamental rejection of our shared values and goals. We had spent 12 years building financial stability, establishing ourselves in Millbrook's business community, and creating a comfortable lifestyle that provided security and opportunities for future growth. My insistence on spending weekends, providing free medical care to people who couldn't afford to pay, seemed to him like a rejection of everything we had worked to achieve together. But what hurt David most deeply wasn't just the practical limitations that my clinic work placed on his business development, but what he perceived as my emotional unavailability and lack of investment in our shared future. He felt that I had become more passionate about serving other people's families than about building prosperity and security for our own household. My growing commitment to addressing healthcare inequality had created a divide between us that made him feel like a secondary priority in my life. David's voice became more intense as he described feeling like he was married to someone whose heart belonged to other people's problems rather than to their own relationship. He had watched me become increasingly absorbed in patient concerns, emotionally drained by clinic responsibilities, and less available for the kind of intimate partnership that had characterized our earlier years together. From his perspective, my volunteer work had gradually eroded the foundation of our marriage by redirecting my energy and passion away from our shared life. As David outlined his grievances and disappointments, I found myself torn between understanding his frustration and feeling defensive about work that had become essential to my sense of purpose and identity. I could see how my Saturday commitments and emotional investment in clinic patients had affected our relationship dynamics and limited David's professional opportunities. But I also felt that he fundamentally misunderstood what my volunteer work meant to me and to the families who depended on our services. The conversation continued with David presenting what he called the logical conclusion of our incompatible priorities and values. He had already spoken with a divorce attorney during the week following his ultimatum, and he was prepared to initiate proceedings that would formally end our marriage and allow both of us to pursue futures that better aligned with our individual goals and commitments. David explained that he wasn't acting out of anger or spite, but rather from a realistic assessment of our fundamental incompatibility. He needed a partner who would support his business development and share his commitment to building financial success and social standing within Millbrook's professional community. I needed the freedom to pursue volunteer work that he couldn't understand or accept as a priority over our marriage's practical needs. The divorce process, David assured me, would be handled professionally and fairly. He had no intention of being vindictive or punitive, but he also couldn't continue in a marriage where he felt constantly competing with my volunteer commitments for attention and priority. His decision was final and had been reached after careful consideration of our fundamental differences and the impossibility of resolving them through compromise. As David outlined the practical aspects of our divorce, including property division, financial arrangements, and timeline considerations, I felt a strange combination of grief and relief. The end of our 12-year marriage was devastating and represented the loss of security, partnership, and shared history that had defined my adult life. But David's clear articulation of his position also eliminated the uncertainty and conflict that had been building between us for months. I realized that David wasn't wrong about the impact of my volunteer work on our relationship and his professional opportunities. My clinic commitment had genuinely limited our social activities, affected my emotional availability, and created priorities that competed with his business development needs. A different kind of wife might have found ways to support her husband's career advancement while maintaining community involvement that complemented rather than complicated his professional goals. But I also knew that I couldn't have chosen differently without betraying my fundamental values and sense of purpose. The families I had served at the health fair needed medical care that wouldn't be available anywhere else, and abandoning that work to focus on David's business networking would have felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about the purpose of healthcare and my responsibility as a nurse. The silence that followed David's explanation of our divorce plans felt heavy with the weight of 12 years of marriage ending and the uncertainty of what would follow. I thought about the comfortable life we had built together, the financial security we had achieved, and the social connections that would probably be divided or lost entirely as our friends and community members processed our separation. But I also thought about Catherine Torres and her cardiac condition that might have remained undiagnosed without our health fair screening services. I remembered Rosa Mendoza's relief when we were able to coordinate emergency care for her daughter's potentially serious neurological symptoms. The meaning and fulfillment I found in serving these families couldn't be replaced by business networking or social climbing, regardless of the personal cost. David concluded our conversation by acknowledging that we had both made choices that reflected our authentic priorities and values, even though those priorities were ultimately incompatible with maintaining our marriage. He respected my commitment to serving others, but he couldn't sacrifice his professional development and business goals to accommodate volunteer work that he viewed as misguided and detrimental to our shared future. As I sat in David's office, processing the formal end of our marriage and the dramatic changes that would follow, I felt a complex mixture of sadness, fear, and unexpected liberation. The security and partnership I was losing felt enormous and irreplaceable, but the freedom to fully embrace my calling to serve vulnerable families also felt like a gift that I hadn't been able to appreciate while navigating the constant tension between competing obligations. The choice I had made to attend the health fair rather than David's conference had revealed fundamental differences in our values and priorities that probably couldn't have been resolved through compromise or negotiation. David needed a wife who would prioritize his business success and their shared financial goals, while I needed to honor my commitment to providing health care to families who had nowhere else to turn for medical assistance. As our conversation concluded and I prepared to begin the process of rebuilding my life as a single woman, I carried with me the knowledge that I had remained true to my values and calling, even when doing so demanded the ultimate personal sacrifice. The future felt uncertain and frightening, but it also felt authentic in a way that the compromise I had been attempting no longer could. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations, moving arrangements, and the strange process of dismantling a 12-year marriage with the same methodical efficiency that David brought to his business operations. Our divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising speed and minimal conflict, primarily because neither of us contested the fundamental incompatibility that had led to this outcome. David's approach to ending our marriage reflected the same professional competence and emotional detachment that had made him successful in building his insurance business. He handled the legal paperwork, property division, and financial arrangements with careful attention to detail and fairness, ensuring that I would be able to maintain basic financial stability even though I was losing the comfortable lifestyle we had built together. The house on Elm Street, which had been our shared home and the symbol of our successful partnership, would be sold with proceeds divided equally between us. Our savings accounts, retirement investments, and shared possessions were cataloged and distributed according to formulas that David had researched and proposed with characteristic thoroughness. There were no dramatic arguments or vindictive demands, just the systematic dissolution of a life we had constructed together over more than a decade. But the emotional impact of these practical arrangements was devastating in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated. Every box I packed, every shared possession that had to be divided, every familiar space that I was preparing to leave forever represented the death of dreams and expectations that had shaped my identity as David's wife and partner in building our comfortable middle-class life. The social consequences of our divorce began almost immediately, as word spread through Millbrook's interconnected business and social networks about the end of our marriage. David's clients and professional associates naturally assumed that he was the injured party, since his wife had apparently chosen volunteer work over supporting his career advancement and business development. My absence from recent networking, events and social gatherings was retrospectively interpreted as evidence of my selfishness and lack of commitment to our marriage's success. The isolation was profound and immediate. Couples who had been our friends for years struggled to maintain relationships with both of us, and most naturally gravitated toward David, who remained visible in the business community and social circles, where we had built our shared connections. Dinner invitations stopped arriving, social gatherings no longer included me, and I found myself excluded from the network of relationships that had provided structure and meaning to my life outside of work. Even my colleagues at Cedar Valley Hospital seemed uncertain how to respond to my changed circumstances. While they were professionally supportive and personally kind, there was an underlying assumption that I had made poor choices that had led to the destruction of my marriage and financial security. The contrast between my situation and that of other nurses who had successfully balanced their careers with stable marriages was often implied rather than stated directly. The financial impact of the divorce was less dramatic than the social and emotional consequences, but it still required significant adjustments to my lifestyle and expectations. The comfortable income that David and I had shared would now support only my basic needs, and I would need to find housing that fit within my single nurse's salary rather than our combined professional earnings. After extensive searching, I found a small apartment above Garcia's grocery store on the south side of town, in the same neighborhood where many of my clinic patients lived. The irony wasn't lost on me that my commitment to serving this community had resulted in my moving into their economic circumstances, trading my spacious suburban home for a modest one-bedroom apartment with thin walls and limited storage space. The apartment was clean and safe, but it represented a dramatic step down from the comfortable lifestyle I had shared with David. Instead of a two-car garage, I had a designated parking space behind the building. Instead of a full basement and multiple bedrooms, I had compact living space that required careful organization to accommodate my possessions. Instead of quiet suburban streets and manicured neighborhoods, I had urban noise and the constant activity of a commercial district. But perhaps the most difficult adjustment was the profound loneliness that accompanied my new circumstances. After 12 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to sharing daily experiences, processing work stress, and making decisions within the context of partnership and mutual support. Living alone required developing entirely new patterns of self-reliance and emotional management that I wasn't sure I was prepared to handle. The evenings were particularly challenging when I would return from my hospital shifts to an empty apartment, with no one to share the experiences of my day or help me process the complicated emotions surrounding my changed circumstances. The silence that had once felt peaceful during brief periods alone now felt oppressive and endless, filled with regrets and second-guessing about the choices that had led to this isolation. I found myself questioning whether my commitment to the Fangua clinic had been worth the enormous personal cost I was paying. David's criticisms of my volunteer work seemed more compelling when I was sitting alone in my small apartment, wondering whether I had been foolishly idealistic in prioritizing other people's needs over my own marriage and financial security. The meaningful work I had done at the health fair felt abstract and distant compared to the immediate reality of my daily loneliness and reduced circumstances. The practical challenges of my new life were constant reminders of what I had lost through my choice to defy David's ultimatum. Simple tasks like grocery shopping required careful budgeting that I hadn't needed to consider when our combined incomes provided comfortable financial margins. Social activities that I had taken for granted became financial luxuries that needed to be weighed against basic necessities like rent and utility payments. My relationship with the Riverside Community Free Clinic became complicated by my changed circumstances and emotional state. While Dr. Wells and other volunteers were supportive and understanding about my divorce, I felt self-conscious about the fact that my personal choices had led to my living in the same economic circumstances as many of our patients. The boundary between provider and community member had become blurred in ways that made me question my effectiveness and credibility as a volunteer. Some Saturday mornings, I would drive to the clinic feeling emotionally exhausted and wondering whether I had the psychological resources to provide effective care to families whose problems seemed to mirror my own reduced circumstances. The confidence and stability that had previously allowed me to serve others from a position of security and comfort had been replaced by uncertainty and vulnerability that sometimes made it difficult to focus on patient needs rather than my own concerns. The weight of regret and self-doubt became particularly heavy during quiet moments when I would compare my current situation to the comfortable life I had shared with David. I would remember weekend mornings when we had leisurely coffee and newspaper reading, vacation planning conversations about destinations we could afford to visit, and the general sense of security that came from shared financial resources and mutual support. But even during my darkest moments of questioning and regret, I couldn't escape the knowledge that my choice to attend the health fair had been morally correct and professionally necessary. The families I had served that day needed medical care that wouldn't have been available anywhere else, and abandoning that work would have represented a betrayal of my fundamental values and calling as a healthcare provider. The tension between my personal losses and my professional convictions created a psychological struggle that dominated my thoughts during those difficult weeks of adjustment to my new circumstances. I had sacrificed my marriage, my financial security, and my social connections for the opportunity to serve vulnerable families, but I wasn't sure whether such sacrifices represented noble dedication or foolish idealism. As I worked to establish routines and find meaning in my changed circumstances, I carried with me the knowledge that my choices had consequences that extended far beyond my own life. The families who had received care at the health fair were managing chronic conditions, following treatment plans, and accessing ongoing medical services because of the intervention our clinic had provided. But I was struggling to find comfort in those abstract benefits while navigating the immediate challenges of rebuilding my life from scratch. The fall from the comfortable middle-class lifestyle I had shared with David to the economic uncertainty of my new circumstances felt both dramatic and symbolic. I had chosen compassion over comfort, service over security, and my calling over my marriage. But the personal cost of such choices was proving more difficult to bear than I had anticipated. When I made the decision to attend the health fair rather than support David's conference networking opportunities, winter settled over Millbrook with an unusual severity that seemed to mirror the bleakness of my emotional landscape as I struggled to adapt to my dramatically altered circumstances. The small apartment above Garcia's grocery store felt cramped and isolating during the long evenings when the Ohio wind rattled the windows, and the sounds of the busy street below served as constant reminders of how far I had fallen from the quiet comfort of my former life. January and February passed in a haze of self-doubt and regret that threatened to overwhelm the conviction that had originally driven my choice to prioritize the clinic over my marriage. The stark reality of my new existence stripped away any romantic notions I might have harbored about the nobility of sacrifice and service. Instead of feeling heroic or principled, I felt foolish and alone, questioning every decision that had led me to trade a stable, comfortable marriage for the uncertain satisfaction of volunteer work. The isolation was the most difficult aspect of my changed circumstances. After 12 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to sharing daily experiences, processing work stress, and making decisions within the framework of partnership and mutual support. Living alone required developing entirely new patterns of emotional self-reliance that I wasn't sure I possessed the strength to maintain long-term. My shifts at Cedar Valley Hospital became both a refuge from the loneliness of my apartment and a painful reminder of the professional relationships I was struggling to maintain in the aftermath of my divorce. While my colleagues remained professionally supportive, there was an underlying current of judgment and incomprehension about the choices I had made. Many of them had successfully balanced demanding careers with stable marriages, and my situation served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing volunteer work over family obligations. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, whose husband was one of the hospital's lead surgeons, made a point of mentioning her own volunteer activities with the hospital foundation during staff meetings, subtly emphasizing how her community service complemented rather than competed with her family's professional and social obligations. Her comments weren't deliberately cruel, but they highlighted the contrast between her approach to balancing service and marriage and the path I had chosen that had resulted in the destruction of my own relationship. The financial constraints of my new circumstances added another layer of stress and adjustment that I hadn't fully anticipated when I made my choice to defy David's ultimatum. The comfortable combined income that David and I had shared was now reduced to my single nurse's salary, which was adequate for basic necessities, but left little margin for the small luxuries and social activities that had previously provided structure and enjoyment to my life. Grocery shopping became an exercise in careful budgeting that required calculating costs and making choices between items that I had previously purchased without consideration. Dinners out, weekend entertainment, and spontaneous purchases became impossible luxuries that had to be weighed against rent, utilities, and other essential expenses. The freedom and security that financial comfort had provided were replaced by constant awareness of economic limitations and the need for careful resource management. But perhaps most challenging was the growing doubt about whether my volunteer work was truly worth the enormous personal cost I was paying. The meaningful impact of serving families at the clinic felt abstract and distant when compared to the immediate reality of my daily loneliness, financial stress, and social isolation. David's criticisms of my priorities seemed increasingly valid when I was sitting alone in my small apartment, wondering whether I had been foolishly idealistic in choosing service over security. The clinic itself became a source of complicated emotions rather than the pure fulfillment it had previously provided. While I continued volunteering on Saturday mornings, I found myself feeling self-conscious about the fact that my personal choices had resulted in my living in circumstances similar to those of many patients we served. The clear boundary that had previously existed between my role as a healthcare provider and the economic reality of our patient population had been blurred in ways that sometimes made it difficult to maintain professional perspective. Dr. Wells and other volunteers were kind and supportive about my changed circumstances, but I could sense their discomfort with the dramatic consequences that my commitment to the clinic had produced in my personal life. No one questioned my dedication or the quality of care I provided, but there was an unspoken awareness that my situation served as an example of how volunteer work could become destructively consuming if not properly balanced with other life obligations. Some Saturday mornings, I would arrive at the clinic feeling emotionally depleted and questioning whether I had the psychological resources to provide effective care to families whose problems often seemed to mirror my own reduced circumstances. The confidence and stability that had previously allowed me to serve others from a position of security and comfort had been replaced by vulnerability and uncertainty that sometimes interfered with my ability to focus on patient needs rather than my own concerns. The contrast between my current situation and my former life became particularly painful during encounters with people who had known David and me as a successful couple within Millbrook's business and social community. Former friends would express awkward sympathy about my divorce while clearly struggling to understand how I had chosen to destroy a stable marriage for the sake of volunteer work that seemed to have brought me nothing but hardship and isolation. These conversations reinforced my growing sense that I had made a catastrophic error in judgment that had cost me everything valuable in my life, while accomplishing nothing meaningful for the families I had intended to serve. The health fair and other clinic activities continued without any obvious dependence on my particular contribution, suggesting that my sacrifice had been unnecessary and that other volunteers could have provided equivalent care without destroying their personal relationships in the process. The weight of regret became particularly heavy during quiet evening hours when I would compare my current circumstances to the comfortable routine I had shared with David. I remembered weekend mornings with leisurely coffee and newspaper reading, vacation planning conversations about destinations we could afford to visit, and the general sense of security that came from shared financial resources and mutual emotional support. The apartment above Garcia's grocery store felt like a constant reminder of my reduced circumstances, with its thin walls that transmitted every sound from neighboring units and the street below, limited storage space that required careful organization of my possessions, and the absence of any private outdoor space where I could find quiet moments of peace and reflection. Winter utility bills strained my carefully managed budget in ways that emphasized my economic vulnerability and the loss of the financial security I had taken for granted during my marriage. The apartment's heating system was inefficient and expensive, forcing me to choose between comfortable temperatures and other necessities like groceries or gas for my car. These daily calculations about basic comfort and survival were humbling reminders of how dramatically my life had changed. The psychological impact of these material constraints was more significant than I had expected. The constant awareness of financial limitations created a baseline stress that affected my sleep, my concentration at work, and my ability to find joy in activities that had previously provided relaxation and pleasure. The simple act of buying coffee at a local cafe became a minor luxury that required careful consideration, rather than the automatic indulgence it had been when David and I shared our combined incomes. But even during my darkest moments of questioning and self-doubt, I couldn't completely escape the knowledge that families like the Torres and Mendoza households were managing their medical conditions more effectively because of the intervention our clinic had provided during the health fair. Catherine Torres was receiving cardiac care that might have saved her life, and Isabella Mendoza had received neurological evaluation that had identified and treated a serious condition that could have had devastating consequences if left undiagnosed. The tension between these abstract benefits and my immediate personal suffering created a psychological struggle that dominated my thoughts during those difficult winter months. I had chosen compassion over comfort, service over security, and my calling over my marriage, but the personal cost of such choices was proving more difficult to bear than I had anticipated when I made the decision to attend the health fair rather than support David's business development. Sleep became elusive during those long winter nights when the apartment felt particularly small and lonely, and my mind would cycle endlessly through questions about whether I had made the right choice and whether the sacrifice had been worth the suffering it had produced. The conviction that had driven my original decision seemed less clear and compelling when viewed through the lens of daily hardship and social isolation. By March, as winter finally began to loosen its grip on Ohio and hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days and gradually warming temperatures, I had reached a point of emotional exhaustion that threatened to undermine my ability to continue functioning effectively either at work or in my volunteer capacity. The depression and self-doubt that had been building throughout the winter months had created a psychological burden that felt increasingly unsustainable. I found myself seriously considering whether it might be time to step back from my clinic, volunteer work, and focus on rebuilding some kind of stable personal life, perhaps even reaching out to David to see whether there might be any possibility of reconciliation if I demonstrated a willingness to prioritize our relationship over my community service commitments. The thought of abandoning the families who depended on the clinic felt like another betrayal, but the thought of continuing to sacrifice my personal well-being for work that seemed to have brought me nothing but suffering felt equally impossible to sustain. The last Saturday morning in March arrived with the kind of crisp spring air that promised renewal and possibility, but I woke feeling the familiar weight of doubt and exhaustion that had characterized my winter months of adjustment to my dramatically altered circumstances. As I prepared for another day at the Riverside Community Free Clinic, I struggled to find the emotional energy and professional focus that effective patient care required. The routine of getting ready for clinic duty had become mechanical rather than purposeful, a series of habits maintained more from obligation than enthusiasm. I gathered my medical supplies, checked the volunteer schedule that Dr. Wells had emailed during the week, and drove through Millbrook's awakening neighborhoods with the detached awareness of someone going through motions rather than pursuing meaningful work. When I arrived at St. Mary's Lutheran Church, I was surprised to find the parking lot unusually crowded for what should have been a typical Saturday morning clinic session. Cars lined both sides of Oak Street, and people were gathered near the church entrance in a way that suggested something unusual was happening. My first thought was that there might be a medical emergency, or that word had spread about a particular health crisis requiring immediate community attention. Dr. Wells was standing near the church entrance, surrounded by a group of people I didn't immediately recognize, holding what appeared to be official documents and speaking with an intensity that suggested important business was being conducted. Jenny Martinez was there as well, along with several other regular clinic volunteers, but they were joined by individuals whose professional attire and formal demeanor indicated they weren't typical Saturday morning patients or medical staff. As I approached the group, carrying my medical bag and struggling to understand what was happening, Dr. Wells noticed me and immediately walked over with an expression of excitement and emotion that I hadn't seen from her since the early days of establishing the clinic. Her eyes were bright with tears, and she was holding an envelope that appeared to contain official correspondence of some kind. Dr. Wells' voice was trembling with excitement as she explained that the crowd of people gathered at the church wasn't there for regular clinic services, but rather to deliver news that would change everything about our volunteer operation and my personal circumstances. Over the past several weeks, she explained, a series of events had been set in motion by community members who had learned about my situation and decided to take action that none of us could have anticipated. The story began with Susan Chun, Tommy's mother, who worked as a waitress at Miller's Diner on Main Street. Miller's Diner was one of those establishments where community news and gossip circulated with the coffee and conversation, and Susan had been sharing her family's gratitude for the medical care Tommy had received at our health fair. Her stories about the clinic's impact on their lives had reached other families who had benefited from our services, creating a growing awareness of the volunteer work we were providing and the personal cost I had paid for my commitment to serving their community. Word about my divorce and reduced circumstances had spread through the network of families we served, many of whom lived in the same South Side neighborhoods where I now resided above. Garcia's grocery store. These families understood economic hardship and social isolation in ways that my former middle-class social circle couldn't comprehend. And they recognized that I had sacrificed my comfortable lifestyle to continue providing them with medical care they couldn't afford to receive. Elsewhere, what had started as informal conversations among clinic patients had gradually evolved into organized community action that reflected both gratitude for the healthcare services we provided and indignation about the personal consequences I had suffered from my volunteer commitment. Families began reaching out to local businesses, community organizations, and civic leaders to share their stories about the clinic's impact and advocate for recognition and support of our work. The momentum had been building throughout the winter months while I was struggling with isolation and self-doubt in my small apartment. Community members were writing letters to the local newspaper, speaking at town council meetings, and organizing fundraising efforts that I had been completely unaware of during my periods of depression and questioning about whether my sacrifice had been worthwhile. Dr. Wells continued explaining the morning's events with growing excitement, as she described how the community organizing had attracted attention from regional healthcare foundations, social service organizations, and even state-level officials who were interested in the clinic as a model for addressing healthcare access issues in rural and underserved communities. The envelope she was holding contained correspondence from the Ohio Department of Health, announcing that our clinic had been selected to receive a substantial grant that would fund expansion of our services, hiring of professional staff, and establishment of a permanent healthcare facility that would serve the region's uninsured and underinsured populations. But the state funding was only part of the story that was unfolding that morning. Local businesses had organized a fundraising campaign that had raised additional resources for clinic operations, and several healthcare organizations had offered partnerships that would provide ongoing support for our mission of serving vulnerable families. The community response had been overwhelming in its scope and generosity, reflecting the deep impact that our volunteer work had made on families throughout the region. As Dr. Wells outlined the various components of support that had been organized on behalf of our clinic, I struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening and what it might mean for both our healthcare mission and my personal circumstances. The recognition and resources being offered represented validation that our work was indeed meaningful and necessary, but I wasn't yet sure how this community support would address the personal costs I had paid for my volunteer commitment. The answer to that question became clear when Dr. Wells introduced me to Sarah Mitchell, a representative from the Regional Healthcare Foundation that was coordinating the expansion of our clinic services. Sarah explained that the community organizing and state recognition had created an opportunity to establish a comprehensive healthcare center that would require professional management and clinical leadership from someone with both medical expertise and demonstrated commitment to serving underserved populations. The position they were offering was clinic director, with responsibilities for overseeing medical services, coordinating community outreach, managing staff and volunteers, and ensuring that our expanded facility continued to prioritize patient needs over financial considerations. The salary being offered was comparable to my hospital position, and the role would allow me to continue serving families who couldn't access traditional health care, while building a sustainable career focused on addressing healthcare inequality. But Sarah Mitchell had more information to share about the community response to my situation and the recognition of my volunteer service. Local businesses and community organizations had raised funds not just for clinic operations, but also to provide personal support for the healthcare providers who had sacrificed to serve their families. A housing fund had been established to help me secure more appropriate living arrangements, and several families had written letters expressing their gratitude and their understanding of what my volunteer commitment had cost me personally. As Sarah outlined the comprehensive support package that had been organized by the community, I felt overwhelmed by the realization that my months of isolation and self-doubt had been occurring, while dozens of families were working to recognize and address the consequences of my service to their community. The loneliness and regret that had dominated my winter experience suddenly seemed less significant compared to the evidence that my work had indeed made a meaningful difference in people's lives. The morning continued with introductions to other community leaders and healthcare officials who had come to announce the clinic expansion and offer their support for our mission. Mike Thompson, a local contractor, had volunteered to oversee construction of our new facility at significantly reduced cost. Dr. Robert Kim, a recently retired physician, had committed to providing regular clinical services that would allow us to offer more comprehensive care than our current volunteer model permitted. But perhaps most moving was the presence of patients and families who had come to express their gratitude and share their stories about how our clinic had impacted their lives. Catherine Torres was there with her husband, both of them eager to thank me personally for the cardiac screening that had led to life-saving treatment for her heart condition. Rosa Mendoza brought Isabella, whose neurological condition had been successfully treated because of the early diagnosis our health fair had provided. These families and others spoke about what our clinic meant to their community and how my personal sacrifice had enabled them to receive medical care that wasn't available through any other means. Their words carried a weight and authenticity that no amount of professional recognition could match, providing the validation and purpose that I had been struggling to find during my difficult winter months. As the morning unfolded and I listened to stories about the impact of our work and the community's gratitude for our service, I began to understand that my choice to prioritize the clinic over my marriage had indeed produced meaningful results. Even though those results hadn't been immediately visible during my period of personal struggle and adjustment, the mysterious arrival of so many community members and officials at our small clinic represented a transformation that extended far beyond anything I could have imagined when I made my choice to attend the health fair rather than support David's business conference. The validation and support being offered felt almost surreal after months of questioning whether my sacrifice had been worthwhile or whether I had simply made a series of costly mistakes that had destroyed my comfortable life without accomplishing anything significant for the families I had intended to serve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.